Well, hello and welcome to North Star Oasis on this July the 13th, 2017. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another action-packed episode of your favorite public affairs programming in what I consider to be the fastest hour on television. I hope you feel the same way. All of our episodes are available on either YouTube or Facebook, so just go to youtube.com/NorthStarOasis or facebook.com/NorthStarOasis. And I say that because a lot of our programming, including today, really kind of goes back to some of the previous episodes. And if you want to understand the full context of the discussion, it would be a helpful hint to start, to go there after this show and start catching up on some of our back episodes. I hope you had a really good 4th of July holiday, Independence Day. We ended up, not necessarily by choice, but through circumstances, ended up having a 4th of July Independence Day holiday of our own. So I'll tell you this, just today, just kind of getting ready for this show. My producer, Dallas Pearson, and I, we're both kind of trying to remember how to do this. And so if things don't quite look as crisp as our shows normally are, that's the reason why. We've had some equipment changes, we've had some equipment malfunctions, things that we're just trying to get back on track with and get back into the flow of things. We're going to start today with our Prager University segment, Born to Hate Jews. What's that all about? Let's check it out.
I was born to hate Jews. It was part of my life. I never questioned it. I was not born in Iran or Syria. I was born in England. My parents moved there from Pakistan. Theirs was the typical immigrant story. Moved to the West in the hope of making a better life for themselves and their children. We were a devout Muslim family, but not extremist or radical in any way. We only wished the best for everyone. Everyone except the Jews. The Jews we believed were aliens living in stolen Muslim land, occupiers who were engaged in a genocide against the Palestinian people. Our hatred, therefore, was justified and righteous, and it made me and my friends vulnerable to the arguments of radical extremists. If the Jews were as evil as we had always believed, mustn't those who support them, Christians, Americans, and others in the West, be just as evil? Beginning in the 1990s, speakers and teachers at mosques and in schools began to endlessly repeat this theme. We were not Western, we were not British, we were Muslims, first and only. Our loyalty was to our religion and to our fellow Muslims. We owed nothing to the Western nations that welcomed us. As Westerners, they were our enemies. All of this had its desired effect. At least, it did on me. It changed the way that I saw the world. I began to see the suffering of Muslims, including in Britain, as the fault of Western imperialism. The West was at war with us, and the Jews controlled the West. My experience at university in Britain only enhanced my increasingly radical beliefs. Hating Israel was a badge of honor. Stage an anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian rally, and you were sure to draw a large, approving crowd. While at university, I decided the protests and propaganda against Israel were not enough. True jihad demanded violence. So I made plans to join the real fight. I would leave college and join a terrorist training camp in Pakistan. But fortunately for me, fate intervened. In a bookstore. I came across a book called The Case for Israel by Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz. The Case for Israel? What case could there be? The title itself made me furious, and I began to read the pages almost as an act of defiance. How ill-informed, how stupid could this guy be to defend the indefensible? Well, he was a Jew. That had to be the answer. Still, I read, and what I read challenged all of my dogmas about Israel and the Jews. I read that it wasn't Israel that created the Palestinian refugee crisis. It was the Arab countries, the United Nations, and the corrupt Palestinian leadership. I read that Jews didn't exploit the Holocaust to create the State of Israel. The movement to create a modern Jewish state dated back to the 19th century, and ultimately to the beginnings of the Jewish people almost 4,000 years ago. And I read that Israel is not engaged in genocide against the Palestinians. On the contrary, the Palestinian population has actually doubled in just 20 years. All this did was make me angrier. I needed to prove Dershowitz wrong, to see with my own eyes how racist and oppressive Israel really was. So I bought a plane ticket. I would travel to Israel, the home of my enemy. And that's when everything changed. Everything. What I saw with my own eyes was even more challenging than what Dershowitz had written. Instead of apartheid, I saw Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisting. Instead of hate, I saw acceptance and even compassion. I saw a raucous, modern, liberal democracy, full of flaws, certainly, but fundamentally decent. I saw a country that wanted nothing more than to live in peace with its neighbors. I saw my hatred melting before my eyes. I knew right then what I had to do. Too many people on this planet are consumed with the same hatred that consumed me. They have been taught to despise the Jewish state. Many Muslims by their religion, many others by their college professors or student groups. So here is my challenge to anyone who feels this way. Do what I did. Seek out the truth for yourself. If the truth could change me, it can change anyone. I'm Kasim Hafiz for Prager University.
That very last statement that he made is exactly why you're watching this show. What is the truth? And that's what we're taking time to go through and try to discover what the truth is. And when I say the truth, I'm looking at the historical nature of how we got into U.S. involvement in the Middle East. We've run a series on that, and as a matter of fact, Dallas, if you're ready, let's show you the slides from our previous episodes to get you kind of up to speed on where we're at as we launch into the next part of the series. So part one was April 7th. We covered the Kurdish independence movement, American hostage crisis in Iran, the Iran-Iraq war, chemical attack at Halabja, and Iraq invades Kuwait. That's more of modern history there. We went to part two a week later, Iraq invades Kuwait, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Desert Fox, Desert Thunder, how the Clinton administration had changed the scope of U.S. foreign policy in Iraq with the Iraq Liberation Act, and then the September 11th, 2001 attack, followed with Operation Enduring Freedom. Part three was even a week after that, April 21st. We covered September 11th, Osama bin Laden and his list of demands, fighting in the Tora Bora Cave Complex, and rare earth elements that were discovered in Afghanistan. Part four, we went April 28th. We worked on the creation of Afghanistan from 1747. Then we covered the Great Game, the Durand Line, formation of the Emirate and Kingdom of Afghanistan, and the Saur Revolution. We continued on May 5th with more about the Saur Revolution, covering the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Operation Cyclone, and then we went into the next slide, please. May 18th, Part 6, more on Operation Cyclone, Peshawar Accord, Afghanistan Civil War, Rise of the Taliban, and Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda formation. Part 7, the pre-Islamic history of the Middle East. So we're kind of going back now. We got kind of caught up, at least as of 2001 to 2003. But the pre-Islamic history of the Middle East and Arabia, history of the Arabian Peninsula, and the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad is where we had covered on our most recent series. Excuse me. So now we're actually going to advance to, we're kind of covering dual track here. We've covered a little bit of Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula, but now we're going to take a look at the ancient times of the Middle Eastern basin and how important the Mediterranean Sea was for the development of civilization. Because we are actually going to lead you eventually to the United States. But we're not going to do it all in one episode. We are going to just start off with taking a more of a geological look at the formation of the Mediterranean Sea right now.
A topic that's always interested me is the geological history of landmarks, particularly ones with unusual characteristics. And the Mediterranean Sea is no exception. The Mediterranean Sea has an average depth of 1,500 meters, 4,900 feet, with its deepest recorded point at 5,267 meters, 17,280 feet. The Mediterranean is nearly landlocked, with a small opening to the Atlantic in the form of the Gibraltar Strait. It experiences little in the way of strong tides, and it has an extremely rapid evaporative rate. In fact, the level of evaporation greatly exceeds both precipitation and river runoff into the Mediterranean. Evaporation is particularly strong in its eastern half, where it's strong enough that the water level actively decreases and becomes more saline, that is, salty, the further east you go in the sea. This means that the Mediterranean's substantial volume is largely dependent on its parent ocean, the Atlantic, in order to counteract its evaporation and maintain its volume. But what if that connection was lost? What if the Mediterranean was instead an inland sea rather than connected to the Atlantic? Well, there was a time when this was the case, and indeed it may happen again. To explain, I first must explain how the Mediterranean came to exist in the first place, which means going back all the way to the Triassic period, almost 250 million years ago. During the Triassic, Earth's above-water landmasses consisted of two supercontinents: Laurasia in the north, consisting of the assemblage of modern Europe, Asia, and North America, and Gondwana in the south, consisting of South America, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, the Arabian Peninsula, Australia, and Antarctica. As these two continental landmasses shifted apart from each other from their initial unity as Pangaea, they formed the Tethys Sea and later the Tethys Ocean, a large body of water that divided the landmasses. This formed a continuous oceanic belt that straddled the Earth between latitude 30 degrees north and the equator. This formation went on for hundreds of millions of years, and the continents gradually pulled away from each other and shifted their positions, moving over time towards their much more familiar configurations. As the united Africa-Arabia supercontinent, now separated from the rest of Gondwana, moved north again, it began closing the Tethys Sea from both the east and west until the Arabian Peninsula struck Asia, creating the Neo-Tethys Sea. During this time, the intersection of the African plates and the European plates would create the Alps, while at the same time increasing the size and depth of the Mediterranean, until finally North Africa struck Europe near the Gibraltar around 5.96 million years ago, sealing the former Tethys Sea off from the Atlantic. These initial bits of isolation weren't lengthy at first. There's geological evidence that the Mediterranean was repeatedly isolated, would begin to dry out, and then would be reflooded by the Atlantic due to the changing geology and ocean conditions. However, around 5.59 million years ago, the Mediterranean was isolated again, and it stayed that way. Isolated from the Atlantic completely by the Gibraltar, the Mediterranean began to dry out. Salinity became 50 times the modern levels. Erosion formed massive canyon systems akin to the Grand Canyon throughout the Mediterranean basin. Massive formations of salt and calcium crystals began to form in deposits in the basin. It's possible that the Mediterranean may have in fact dried up completely, or at least formed very small, very few large brine lakes. But not only that. Due to the depth of the basin, now dry, combined with the winds blowing over it and the adiabatic process, the temperature down the basin would have been hellish. At 4 kilometers below sea level in the basin, it's predicted that it would have been 40 degrees Celsius, that's 72 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than it would have been at sea level. That means a theoretical maxima temperature of around 80 degrees Celsius, 176 degrees Fahrenheit. Plus the air pressure would be nearly twice that at sea level. This event is known as the Messinian Salinity Crisis. Within a millennium, the Mediterranean Sea had almost completely dried up, and its deepest regions become a hellscape that little could live within. A 500,000 years later, climate conditions began to shift, allowing the basin to receive more fresh water from rivers in Europe and Africa. But it did not end the crisis by any means, just helping support the few inland bodies that remained in the desiccated basin. But 5.33 million years ago, 0.63 million years after the Mediterranean was isolated from the Atlantic and almost completely dried away, something momentous occurred. The Gibraltar Strait broke. Permanently. And by doing so, it let loose the Zanclean Flood, an incredible deluge of water that rushed into the basin from the Atlantic. This massive outburst flood tore open the modern Gibraltar Strait and filled the entire Mediterranean basin in a period between several months and 2 years. It's estimated that the sea level rose in the basin at rates greater than 10 meters per day, driven by a flow rate of 1,000 times the Amazon River, in both sloping channels and tremendous waterfalls. The sudden opening of the Gibraltar resulted in the global sea level decreasing by nearly 10 meters, 33 feet, during this period, and further reduced the overall salinity of the world's oceans. The result was the newborn Mediterranean Sea, now almost entirely a child of the Atlantic, with little of the ways of its Tessis biodiversity likely surviving the crisis. The increased saline conditions would make it still very unique from the Atlantic, however, and many Atlantic animals came into the Mediterranean and began to adapt to its differences, filling the now very open niches. But interestingly enough, this event could happen once again, someday, though very far in the future in the human timescale. The African plate continues to subduct the Eurasian and Anatolian plates. Over time, this could cause the Mediterranean to be closed up again, or perhaps vanish entirely. There's no way to ultimately know. The Earth is highly unpredictable, and we have a hard enough time telling what it's already done, let alone what it could possibly someday do. Still, it's fascinating to know that the landmark we know today, the cradle of Western civilization, is itself but a babe to the world. A fragile, unique thing that was created in almost an instant. A very, very, very wet instant.
What I'm going to
That, folks, is how we got the Mediterranean Sea. Now, what has the Mediterranean Sea got to do with the United States' current political situation in the Middle East, other than the fact that you have Israel at the very far end of, one end of the Mediterranean Sea? But the fact is, that's kind of the cradle of civilization, and that's actually been important throughout world history, not just ancient history, but even modern history. Everything seems to start in the Mediterranean basin. We're going to take a look right now at Ancient of Days, a PowerPoint presentation I put together. We're going to go over a couple of slides here. So, here we have the ancient Near East, biblical times, 4500 BC to 509 BC. This is known as the cradle of civilization. And if you actually were to read through the Old Testament, some of these names are actually quite familiar. The Hittites are mentioned, Sumer's in there, Canaan, the land of milk and honey. This is what the Middle East looked like back during that time. We're talking half a millennium before the birth of Christ. That is the cradle of civilization. That is where, modern civilization really started to develop. Yes, there was some development in Egypt. I believe the dynasties there began around 2100 BC. And then if you look in China, which we don't have a slide to show, but China, I think their earliest dynasty started around 2200 BC, if I recall correctly. So this is really, and that's not to say that life didn't begin in either Egypt or in China, around this time, but this is when we really start to see the beginnings of a modern type of civilization. Next slide. We're experiencing technical difficulties. And so then from 509 BC to 27 BC, Rome started to control more of the Mediterranean world. They expanded from the city of Rome and its immediate surroundings to hegemony over the entire Mediterranean world. And this is what the Roman Republic looked like before it became a Roman Empire. And then we had actually covered this about 2 years ago. The Second Punic War from 218 to 201 BC. It was Carthage versus Rome. Rome had 775,000 troops. Carthage had 700,000 troops. Can you imagine 14 to 15 U.S. bank stadiums filled with warriors? That's the kind of size of armies that we're talking here. Each side had, back up, each side sustained losses around 300,000. So 3 to 3.5 full U.S. bank stadiums of people were lost. And this is when the population was not like it is now. And then Hannibal, a Carthaginian warrior, he drove elephants over the Alps to surprise Rome. And that's what we had actually covered pretty extensively a couple of years ago. And then the Carthaginians were the ones who introduced the concept of crucifixion as punishment to the Romans at this point in time. There was no crucifixion going on anywhere in the Roman Republic, Roman Kingdom at all prior to the Second Punic War. And it was nasty for the way that the Carthaginians used that as their punishment against their enemies. And crucifixion, of course, is hanging people on a cross and nailing them, and it is an extremely brutal form of torture. And then here is the purple or blue that you see on the screen is the Carthaginian area, and then the red is Rome. That's what Rome held. So Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, and Italy. Then we had the Roman Empire. The Carthaginians lost the Second Punic War to Rome. Rome became powerful, really, really powerful. And by 27 BC to 476 AD, they controlled the region at the time of Christ. And it was divided into the eastern and western sections in 395 AD. But the entire Mediterranean basin, and really if you take a look at World War II in the European theater, it covered North Africa, a little bit of the Middle East, and all throughout Europe, even in the 20th century. We were still fighting over the old Roman Empire lands. And then with the Second Temple period of the Roman rule, which began in 63 BC, it was 30 years after Christ's crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. It continued until a revolt from 66 to 70 and a Jewish uprising to fight for independence was eventually crushed after 4 years. Culminated in the capture of Jerusalem and the burning and destruction of the temple. That was the second temple that was built. The first one was destroyed and then it was rebuilt. And then there was the center of the national and religious life of the Jews throughout the world. Jerusalem was already also destroyed. The Jewish diaspora at the time of the temple's destruction, according to Josephus, a historian who was alive and had recorded what his observations at the time, they went to what we now know as Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kurdistan, the area of the Kurds. And in Josephus' own words, he'd informed even the remotest Arabians about the destruction of the temple. And then it was the crisis under Caligula that was the first open break between Rome and the Jewish people. And so it ended the Second Temple period of Jewish history, and there is a depiction on the right. And then if you take a look at the left photo, remnants of the Roman destruction of the temple near the Western Wall can still be viewed today. Now keep in mind, President Donald Trump just visited that area a couple of weeks ago. And so when he was at the Western Wall, he could have still seen the destruction of the temple from the Romans at this period of time. And that is what we have for that. That's just kind of to give you a little bit of an idea of what we want to cover for the rest of this episode today. So we're going to cover more on the ancient history. We're going to take a look right now at the overview of early Judaism, part 1.
What I'm going to do in this video is give a very high-level history of some of the significant events in Judaism. And I will use the word history loosely because historians aren't able to really find a lot of evidence for some of what I'm going to talk about before the first millennium BCE. These stories we get from the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, often referred to as the Torah, also the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Also, we get them from the Muslim Quran. but there isn't a lot of historical evidence for them. And so many historians view it more along the lines of legend, but there are many people who view these as historic facts and have attempted to place them on a historic timeline. And what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to attempt to fit onto this historic timeline where some of those the people who believe it did happen, when they believed it happened, but keep in mind that there's not a lot of strong archaeological evidence, historical record here, and these accounts were written several hundred years after when they were purported to occur. So let's start in the beginning. Let's start in the book of Genesis, in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, and the Old Testament. And I'm not going to go into detail on the book of Genesis. It starts, of course, with God, the monotheistic God, creating the heavens and earth. And then we have the stories of Adam and Eve, and then several generations later, the story of the great flood of Noah. And then Noah's son, Shem. And I talk about Shem because this is where the word Semitic comes from. You might have heard people refer to Jewish people as Semitic, but also Arab people are referred to as Semitic because according to biblical accounts, they are both viewed as descendants of Abraham, who is a descendant of Shem. So they are viewed as Semitic. The first real significant patriarch of the Hebrew Bible is considered Abraham, who I just mentioned. And it has Abraham moving from Ur, from the city of Ur, and there's debate on which Ur that is. It might be the ancient Sumerian city in lower Mesopotamia, or some people believe that it was an Ur in upper Mesopotamia. But regardless of which account you take, and once again, Abraham is considered by many historians as a legendary figure, so there's not clear evidence that he existed in a historical sense. But if you take the accounts in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible, he would have gone with his family from Ur and eventually migrated to Canaan, which is in near or around modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, that general area. So it's either from this Ur or that Ur. And Abraham is considered the first of the three significant patriarchs for the Jewish people. The other two are Isaac and Jacob. And once again, I could do a whole series of videos on the stories of Abraham. But Abraham's first son is Ishmael, who he has with the servant of his wife Sarah after they determine that they're not able to, or they don't think that they're able to have children. And according to biblical accounts, Ishmael is viewed as the progenitor, as the patriarch of the Arab people. But later in life, Abraham, and at this point he is roughly 100 years old, and his wife Sarah, according to biblical accounts, is in her 90s, they have Isaac, who is considered a significant patriarch in Judaism. And this is a painting by Rembrandt of the famous Abraham being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, but then he gets stopped at the last minute. But it's viewed as a sign of his willingness his faith in God and his willingness to follow God. Now, Isaac's son is Jacob, and Jacob is later named by God as Israel. And so this is where the word Israelites come from, and even the modern state of Israel. Now, one of Jacob's son is Joseph, and once again, this is according to biblical accounts. There isn't a lot of historical evidence here, but it's a fascinating story, the story of Joseph, how he is sold by his brothers into slavery and taken from Canaan to Egypt. But Joseph, once again, fascinating story, is eventually able to rise through the ranks, become the vizier of Egypt, and later his family, including Jacob, come to Egypt when there's a famine in Canaan. And that is the explanation for the biblical settlement of a significant fraction of the Israelites in Egypt. but then they are enslaved. And according to biblical accounts, they are enslaved for 400 years, over 400 years. And that's what you see in this green line right over here. And they stay enslaved in Egypt until we get to Moses, who is considered the most significant of the prophets in the Jewish tradition, and one of the very most significant prophets amongst Christians and Muslims. So let's get to Moses. So Moses' story, once again, one of these famous stories, how the Pharaoh is feeling threatened by the growing population of the Jewish people, who, remember, are enslaved. And so, as the story goes, he orders all newborn Hebrew Jewish boys to be killed, but Moses' mother hides Moses, and he puts him on a basket in the Nile, and the Pharaoh's daughter discovers him and raises Moses. And so he's able to get an education and is part of the royal court of the Pharaoh. But later in life, he sees a slave master that's abusing a Jewish person to death, and then he kills the slave master. And so he's afraid for his life, and so he runs away, fearing the penalty for killing the slave master. And he goes to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and this is where we think the biblical this is where the current Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb is, and that's where we think the biblical one might have been. And that's where we have the story of the burning bush, where he is commanded by God, who is kind of the angel of the Lord, is speaking through this bush and telling Moses, go back, and you need to free the Jewish people from enslavement. And so he does go back, and he is able to liberate them. And once again, this is a very famous story, and the Pharaoh's armies follow him. He parts the Red Sea. The Pharaoh's army is eventually destroyed, and he takes the Jewish people back to Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb. And these are sometimes viewed as two different mountains, sometimes the same mountains, different sides of the same mountains. We are not exactly sure, but most people view them as the same mountain. And it was at Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, where now Moses is able to receive the famous Ten Commandments, and he's able to receive the Jewish laws. And the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the authorship of these is ascribed to Moses. So once Moses, and once again, historians really debate that, but this is according to biblical accounts. Now, once he receives this word of God, he then takes the Jewish people, they set up a tabernacle, they go through the desert for 40 years, and he brings them to the promised land, and before entering, Moses dies. But he essentially is able to resettle the Jewish people back in Canaan.
So that is kind of to get you up to speed. We will actually, and I'll let you know this already, I mentioned the Punic Wars. We are going to come back to the Punic Wars, but it's important to understand as we look at today's society and how everybody seems to want to hate the Jews throughout the world. And I've even heard, white Protestant people here in America who want to make the Jews the whipping boy for everything. You look at Adolf Hitler, who hated the Jews. Everyone's persecuting the Jews, it seems. But now it's important for us to look at how the Jews and the Jewish culture started and how it fits into modern society. So we're going to get there. But we're going to take a look right now. We covered the Jewish people a little bit to get you, acclimated from the Mediterranean basin formation, the history of the early Jewish people. Now we're going to take a look a little bit closer at the Roman Empire and how that developed.
"2,000 years ago, in the land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, there was a vast empire, the Roman Empire. In this empire were grand cities, magnificent buildings, and riches of every kind. Rich emperors lived in palaces, and beggars lived on the street. Long roads connected all the cities of the empire, and all roads led to the capital, the grandest city in the world. All roads led to Rome. So let's step back in time to see what life was like in that ancient city. A day spent in ancient Rome would be a very full day, and it would start at sunrise. In these days before electric lights, it was necessary to get everything done while the sun was shining. That meant getting an early start to every day. Since the weather in Rome is warm most of the year, and since they were out when the warm sun was shining, Romans wore garments called tunics that left their legs bare. Most Romans had only one outfit that they wore every day, and it was rarely washed. The wealthy, on the other hand, wore draping pieces of fabric called togas over their tunics. And the most important Roman citizens wore togas with a bold, colorful stripe to make them stand out in the crowd. Finishing off a Roman outfit were sandals made of leather, not too different from the shoes of today. Roman homes were variations on familiar concepts as well. Very few people had houses of their own. But those who did lived in houses that were built around beautiful courtyards that may have even had swimming pools. Most people, however, lived in small apartment buildings that were made mostly of wood. For fear of fire, residents did not cook inside. They bought food already prepared, usually no more than soup and bread. Some people sat at tables, but most ate sitting on the floor. Mealtime in the homes of the wealthy was a different story. They ate large feasts and were served as they reclined on couches.
And that, boy, that went by really, really quickly. But that's to give you an idea of what life was like in the Roman Empire. Now, he made reference to the roads. Rome had built a huge network of roads. So transportation between these large areas of the country or of the empire, people had mobility. Now, it wasn't fast mobility. It wasn't like going down a freeway. It wasn't like going down the Autobahn. It wasn't fast, but you could walk literally from Greece to Italy. They had a road. They even extended, they actually had a few roads in, when the Roman Empire went into England, they actually had developed roads there. Throughout Europe, they had actually developed certain amounts of roads. They made a lot of roads in transportation. So that's one of the biggest reasons why the Roman Empire got to be as big as it was, as people could travel. Then they could also move armies extremely quickly in comparison to more of the nomadic tribal regions that were conquered. But I know I'm digressing a little bit here, but it's important for us looking back at this period of world history, the rise of, the formation of the Mediterranean basin, the rise of the Israeli people, and then the rise of the Roman Empire, and then of course we're right now at the 1250 BC era. We're going to advance a little bit more back into that 218 BC era to look at the Punic Wars. And I remember I mentioned crucifixion came from the Carthaginians. Hannibal had brought his elephants through what we would now call Spain, over the Alps and into Rome, fought a lot of battles there, but then Rome ended up conquering Carthage. So let's take a quick look here at the Punic Wars. We're only doing 3 to 4 minutes on this.
In the 3rd century BC, the Carthaginians were the dominant sea power in the Mediterranean, and its empire stretched from Spain to Tunisia. Meanwhile, the Romans had taken over the Italian peninsula and had intentions to carry on expanding. But the wars began in Sicily around 280 BC, when a band of Italian mercenaries, the Mamertines, began to ravage the land. The small Sicilian state of Syracuse attacked them, so the Mamertines asked the Carthaginians for help. The Carthaginians obliged, but the mercenaries did not like being under Carthaginian protection, so formed an alliance with Rome. This new alliance put Rome at war with Carthage in 264 BC. The Romans marched into Sicily, defeated Syracuse, and forced them to become their ally. Yet, the Carthaginians, later under the command of Hamilcar Barca, held out despite numerous losses. In 261 BC, the Romans then set about creating a navy to rival the Carthaginians, and for the next 20 years, fought the Carthaginians at sea. Roman naval successes left Carthage unable to fund the creation of new ships, so in 241 BC sued for peace, with Rome taking most of Sicily. The devastated economy of Carthage led to mercenaries revolting in the capital. It was eventually crushed, but the Romans took advantage of the uprising to annex Sardinia and Corsica. In the aftermath of the revolt, the successful general in Sicily, Hamilcar, was disgruntled with the Senate, so he marched an army into Spain and brought a great deal of land under Carthage control. His son Hannibal eventually took control in 219 BC and attacked the town of Saguntum, a Roman ally. War broke out the next year, 23 years after the First Punic War ended. Hannibal took his powerful army on land to Italy and famously crossed the Alps with elephants. However, he lost most of his siege engines on the Alps and therefore couldn't take Rome itself. Meanwhile, a Roman army under Scipio marched west into Spain. Over the next few years, Hannibal's army crushed the Romans in battle, notably at the Battle of Cannae, and devastated the countryside of southern Italy. So the Romans, under Fabius Maximus, avoided battles and tried to wear the Carthaginians down through a war of attrition. Meanwhile, the Romans were successful in Sicily. The Syracuse allied themselves with Carthage, and the Romans lay siege to their capital. The city held out for a couple of years thanks to the innovations of the famed inventor Archimedes, but it eventually fell in 212 BC. But elsewhere they weren't so successful. In Spain, the Roman armies were defeated and their commander Scipio was killed in 211 BC, plus they also had to deal with a new enemy at the outbreak of the Roman-Macedon War. However, the situation for the Romans eventually changed in 210 BC. Scipio's son, later Scipio Africanus, landed an army in Spain and took New Carthage, the most important city in the region. With it, he gathered a great deal of supplies and allies and crushed the Carthaginian forces in Spain at the Battle of Elypia in 206 BC. However, while Scipio Africanus was campaigning in Spain, Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, decided to leave Spain and join his brother in the Italian campaign. He arrived in 207 BC, but the Romans were able to intercept him from joining forces with his brother by defeating him at the Battle of Metaurus. Now the Romans had the advantage. The Carthaginian defeats resulted in political uprisings in the Numidian tribe, a powerful ally of Carthage. A young prince aligned himself with Rome, and Rome took advantage of this situation. In 204 BC, Scipio Africanus was deployed to Africa to unite with the Numidians and fight the Carthaginians on their home front. The Romans devastated the Carthaginian forces at the Battle of the Great Plains. Now the Carthaginians were desperate, so made peace with Rome and recalled Hannibal from Italy. However, Carthage quickly broke their armistice, so Scipio Africanus led his forces into battle against Hannibal at the Battle of Zama and crushed his army for one last time, ending the Second Punic War in 201 BC. Carthage was stripped of its empire and reduced to a small Roman client state in modern-day Tunisia. Rome was now the dominant power in the Mediterranean and, over the next 50 years, expanded its empire a great deal. Finally, in 149 BC, they turned their attention to Carthage once more, as they feared they could regain their strength. They declared war, the Third Punic War, and lay siege to the city. And 3 years later, the city had fallen. Rome destroyed the city, massacred hundreds of thousands, and sold the rest into slavery, ending Carthage forever.
In the last
And that's how we ended up getting the Roman Empire. It's amazing stuff. I know that was the very quick abbreviated version. Highly recommend, if you are interested in knowing more about this region, study the Punic Wars, because there's a lot of stuff that happened in those Punic Wars, deeper than the surface stuff that we've covered. And it gives greater context as to the development of the Roman Empire. And as we know, the Roman Empire spread and had a lot of innovation, but a lot of decline and ruin. And really, we've been things have been screwed up in the Mediterranean basin ever since. But we're going to take a look now. Here we've covered, I'm going to repeat again, the formation of the Mediterranean basin, the early history of the Jewish people. Then we went to the Roman Empire and the Punic Wars. Now let's go back. Take another look at the development of of Judaism during the Roman Empire.
Last video, we started with the story of the patriarchs in Genesis, how Abraham settles his people in Canaan, but eventually they get enslaved in Egypt. And according to the Old Testament, that enslavement lasts for over 500 years until we have the emergence of Moses, whom we also spoke about in the last video. And the next 4 books of the Hebrew Bible, which are often given authorship to Moses, these really talk about Moses freeing the Jewish people from enslavement, getting the commandments, the law from God, and eventually bringing the people so that they can resettle back in Canaan. And as I mentioned in the last video, these first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, also the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament, they are referred to as the Torah, and they are given authorship to Moses, although historians are doubtful of that, and even the historicity, to the degree to which these are historical characters, are significantly debated. But we have the Jewish people, according to biblical accounts, now in Canaan. And as we go into the rest of this video, we're getting into more of a historical period with the first significant kings of the Israelites. So now we're getting into the first millennium BCE. The people, the Israelites, are settled in Canaan. And around in the 11th century BCE, you have King Saul comes to power, and he's considered to be the first significant king of the first king, really, of a united kingdom of Israel and Judah. So this is King Saul. He is then succeeded by King David, and who is his son-in-law, but it was a very contentious succession. And David is considered a significant figure in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. He's considered a warrior, poet, philosopher. He really strengthens and really unifies the kingdom. And then he's succeeded by his son, King Solomon. And King Solomon is famous in biblical accounts for his wisdom. And he's also known for creating the first temple in Jerusalem. And as we will see, this first temple in Jerusalem, the way that I've marked it off on this timeline, the green is periods according to biblical accounts, and then later according to historical accounts as well, when the Jewish people were, for the most part, not in Canaan, where they were in captivity or they were being enslaved, they were in exile someplace else. The white that I show here, and so this is the enslavement in Egypt, and this is going to be the Babylonian captivity that we're going to talk about shortly. And then the white, this is when we have the existence of the temples in Jerusalem. So the first temple in Jerusalem, this is a depiction of it, was built by Solomon. Now, the unified kingdoms of Judah and Israel don't last beyond these 3 kings. Shortly thereafter, it gets fragmented into 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. And the kingdom of Israel is going to be overrun by the Neo-Assyrians in 722, when they refused to pay tribute to the Neo-Assyrian king. And the kingdom of Judah essentially becomes a client state of the Assyrians. And it's important to keep in mind, even though these are called kingdoms, for most of these history, they're client states to larger powers, whether it's the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Seleucids. They keep being client states, but they are also have some degree of autonomy, which is why they're called kingdoms. So in 722, you have the kingdom of Israel being overrun and many of the Jewish people having to go into exile and being held captive by the Neo-Assyrians. And then as we get into the 6th century BCE, you have the famous Babylonian conquest, the Neo-Babylonian conquest of Nebuchadnezzar II, who conquers Judah. And once again, this is really a side battle between the Neo-Babylonians and the Egyptians, and we talk about that in other videos. But that takes us to the Babylonian captivity. So this is a picture here of Jerusalem, and maybe as equally important, that first temple of Solomon being destroyed and the Jewish people being taken into captivity, where they are taken from Jerusalem, to Babylon. And they're held in captivity. A significant fraction of them are held in captivity in Babylon from this period from around 597, 586 BCE until Babylon is conquered by Cyrus the Great, conquered by the Achaemenid Persians that we talk about in another video. And so once again, the end of the captivity is really a side effect of larger battles and conquests going on. But Cyrus the Great, he frees the Jewish people in 538 BCE. This is the end of the Babylonian captivity. And he resettles them back in Jerusalem. And he also assists, and his successors assist in the rebuilding of the temple. And so then you have the second temple of Jerusalem. And you often will hear Second Temple Judaism, because this is a period now where the Jewish people are resettled in Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that second temple, that a lot of the Old Testament takes its modern form. Now, this is going to last for several hundred years. As I mentioned, the kingdom of Judea is a client state of all of these various empires, and it eventually becomes a client state of the Roman Empire as we get into the end of the first millennium BCE. And as we get to 70 CE, so this is shortly after the time of Jesus, you have the first Jewish-Roman war, sometimes referred to as the Jewish Revolt. And in that, the Romans destroy the second temple. And this is really significant. The second temple, which, as we mentioned, it starts getting rebuilt at the end of the captivity, and famously gets really nicely constructed as we get into the 1st century BCE. But then in 70 CE, Jerusalem is destroyed again, this time by the Romans. And this is the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, where they are exiled for, now we're talking thousands of years, from Rome, and they spread through the Roman Empire and other empires, and we talk more about that in other videos. And this is a significant thing because now the Jewish people are, for the most part, dispersed. They don't have a temple, and you don't see a significant resettlement of Jewish people into this area until we get to the 20th century.
And there you have it. So that's really, we've accomplished what I set out to accomplish today. We wanted to go through the history of the Mediterranean basin. I really wanted to go from essentially the formation of the earliest peoples in that area through the 70 CE, Common Era, AD, if you will, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, whichever way you want to look at it, because this has a lot to do with what happens about 2 millennia later, a millennia and a half. There's a lot of stuff that went on here. Now, if you look at the New Testament, that really covered a lot of the 1 century in the Common Era, the 1st century. Paul's letters throughout the Roman Empire, Ephesia, Galatia, Corinth, his letters to the Romans, the Acts of the Apostles. All of this takes place at the time of Christ and for the next couple of decades afterwards. And that is where, we kind of leave things off for right now. We're going to pretty much end the show around this point. We're not going to really get too much into Christianity, although we are going to kind of end with a music video with the song Worthy is the Lamb, and we're going to have some video from the film Passion of the Christ. It's because we're talking about this particular period. So let's go to the video.